Okay, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone. It's very encouraging to see such a robust turnout and everybody that has made it out here today to the event. We really appreciate your support, your attendance. And my name is Michael Berry. I direct the Center for Chinese Studies here at UCLA. And before we get started, just a couple thank yous to people who made this event possible. I want to thank our Assistant Director from the Center of Chinese Studies, Esther Zhou, who is over here to my right. Her work behind the scenes makes a lot of these events possible. So thank you, Esther. This is also part of a collaboration with multiple UC campuses. Peter is visiting UC Irvine, UC San Diego. He's also making a stop to Pomona. And so we've been working together behind the scenes to kind of make this tour a reality. So I want to thank all my colleagues at the various UCs, especially Emily Baum at UC Irvine. Thanks to Chun Su at the East Asia Library and Andrea Goldman, who I see here from the Asia Pacific Center. They have co-sponsored this event and helped spread the word. And finally, if you're new to our events, the Center for Chinese Studies is now in its 38th year. We do a lot of programming. Here, there's a kind of echo. Is the echo okay on your end in the audience? Okay, great. So we do a lot of programming here at the Center for Chinese Studies. Every event, we're putting on roughly 50 events. So if you're not familiar with our programming, I really want to encourage you to go online to CCS UCLA, join our mailing list. We're doing events like this almost every week throughout the academic year. So encourage you to get involved. We'd love to see you at future CCS events. It's my really great honor to be able to introduce our speaker today, Peter Hessler. Peter is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He previously served as Beijing correspondent from 2000 to 2007, later Cairo correspondent from 2011 to 2016, and Chengdu correspondent from 2019 to 2021. He is the author of numerous books, which you see displayed before you, Country Driving, Oracle Bones, Rivertown, the most recent book, which is this one, Other Rivers, A Chinese Education, is part of what we're going to be talking about today. He has won numerous awards, including being a finalist for the National Book Award. He was the 2008 National Magazine Award for Excellence in Reporting, and he was also a MacArthur Fellow in 2011. And over the years, I've learned so much from Peter's work, and let's give him a very warm welcome and show him how happy UCLA is to host him here today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael, and thanks everybody for coming today.
And so today the format is going to be a moderated dialogue. Peter and I will engage in discussion for roughly an hour or so. And then the second half, we're going to open it up to you because I know Peter has a lot of very loyal fans and readers. And so we want to kind of involve you in the discussion as well. And I want to kind of go back to the beginning and start with your relationship with China, which is the mid-90s and the Peace Corps. Could you talk about the factors that initially led you to China? And what was your life like, say, on the eve of going to China? What were your dreams? What were your goals? And how did all of that transform after stepping foot in Fuling?
Yeah, I mean, China wasn't part of my life during my education, during my years of education. It wasn't something, I did not have an interest in China growing up or in high school or in college, and I wasn't traveling overseas either. I grew up in a fairly small place in Missouri. Didn't even have a passport in high school and college. I wasn't traveling overseas. I wanted to be a writer, though, I think since when I was 16. So I had an English teacher as a sophomore in high school who encouraged me and said, you have some ability, you should think about this. And I settled on that as something I wanted to do. So I was quite serious about that. I really thought about it a lot and worked at it from the time I was in high school. And then I was fortunate to go to a university, Princeton, which had a great creative writing department at that time. So I had great teachers. Joyce Carol Oates was my thesis advisor. Russell Banks is a great novelist. I took classes from him, and John McPhee, who taught nonfiction. But when I left university, I was still thinking I wanted to write fiction. I went to Oxford for 2 years for graduate school. And in some ways, what led me to China was very indirect, because when I finished at Oxford, I realized I did not want to become a professor of English literature. I still wanted to become a writer. I wasn't sure how. I was thinking maybe I'll apply to the Peace Corps and go overseas. But in the meantime, I thought, well, let's go home in the wrong direction. So I was with a friend and we flew from England to the Czech Republic, and then we just started traveling by bus and train through Eastern Europe and then into Russia. And our goal was to go to Asia. And the only way really to go from Russia to Asia without flying was the train. So we took the Trans-Siberian, and that puts you in Beijing at the end. And it's funny because on the way we had met people coming the other direction, and they all had bad things to say about China. They all said that it was, it's a real hassle. It's hard to get around. This was 1994. So there weren't tons of people traveling there. And so we showed up in Beijing in 1994, and something about it really grabbed me. It just, there was an energy there. And especially, Russia in 1994, the economics were bad, and you could kind of feel that people felt a little bit beaten down. People were waiting in line to change money all the time. And it just, when you got to China, there was just stuff that was happening. You could really tell people were trying to get things done. And I just got fascinated. So it really was contact was what drew me to it. And we ended up extending our stay in China. We traveled for more than a month. Of course, I didn't speak any Chinese, but by the end of that trip, I continued through Vietnam and Laos and Thailand and other places. But at the end of that trip, I decided I want to go back to China and try to live here for a longer period of time. I'd always liked the idea of the Peace Corps for various reasons. And so when I applied to the Peace Corps, I pushed them to send me to China. I basically told them I wasn't going to go anywhere else.
Do you still have memories from the first time you landed in China, those earliest impressions, and how it differed maybe from what your imagination had been or your expectations had been?
Yeah, I remember the first contact with China in a way was the train, because the train was sort of a funny experience because they had cars that were Russians, and then it was like maybe one car for foreigners, which was a few backpackers who had found their way onto it. And then there were the Chinese cars. And our car, the conductor, it was mostly foreigners, although there was like North Koreans who were going back, these government officials. It was very bizarre. But there was a Chinese conductor on our car, the train attendant. And one thing I remember very vividly was that there was kind of an uptight French couple on the train. And there was a sign on the thing, many signs that said no smoking. And they, in some ways, a very un-French behavior. They were complaining about the smoking in the car, which people were smoking all the time. And they went and complained to the attendant again and again. And finally, he took a screwdriver and took the sign, the no smoking sign, off the car, which in some ways was a very good introduction to how people got things done in China in a way. And we saw somebody was in a car where they saw one of the guys, because a lot of people were taking boxes of goods, because this is also hard to imagine, but they were taking products from Europe to China, right? Some of them were like factory made things that, of course, within a few years were all going to be made in China, but it was still some stuff moving the other direction. And they had seen one of the guys, Chinese guy in their car, give this conductor a lot of cash. And then as they got to the Mongolian border, he went in there with a saw and sawed a hole in the ceiling really carefully, and then put all the boxes up there so the customs people wouldn't see them. And this was all done very efficiently. So that was the kind of thing I noticed, like it just, you could tell that people were pushing, I think that was an accurate impression of that moment. But there was humor to it in life, and that attracted me.
And, that actually corresponds to the first time I went to China as well, same period, mid-90s. And when I think about that period from then till now, I often use the metaphor of cat years. Often we say one cat year is a 7 cat year, one human year is 7 cat years, because the transformation was so rapid. And over the course of this change, I'm wondering if you could talk about how to convey that kind of radical social change that you've lived through to your readers, or even our younger audience members here, those born after 2000. Can you just talk about that radical transformation from that period till now?
Yeah, part of what I realized it was very easy to miss important things, because there were actually momentous things were happening all the time, and often you didn't recognize the significance. Like everybody here, probably you're of the generation where the Chinese people who are here know what a Zhoubao University is, the 985. The kind of the elite universities in China that is based on a speech in May of 1998 that Jiang Zemin gave at I think it was at Beida, I believe, for the May 4th anniversary. And that's the kind of thing that we had at the time. I was teaching that month, but I don't remember anybody talking about it. Nobody was aware of it. I also remember my tutor, my Chinese tutor that spring talking about how, oh, they're changing our apartments and now they're no longer going to be owned by the Danwei, they're no longer be owned by the work unit. Everybody has to buy them. And I didn't realize that this was happening like on such a scale all over the country, so these things that you thought, oh, this is just a local thing, that actually were much bigger. Same thing with my students. The first cohort I taught, all of their jobs were assigned by the government. And then the second year, the next graduating students, most of them were having to find their own jobs. And so these changes would happen like that. And you were sort of vaguely aware of them, but not fully aware of the significance. I think that was part of it. When you talk about that pace of change, once I started writing about China, I did realize that that was a big advantage for a writer, because as a nonfiction writer, one problem you have is you can't create plot, right? I mean, you can do this as a novelist. You can make things happen, and you can't do that as a nonfiction writer. And so one thing that you do is you find somebody who's had an interesting story, and then you back report it, and then talk to them about what they experienced, and then you write that story. But the problem with that is that people's memories are selective. They're not necessarily going to tell you the things that were most important. And the other problem is you've already chosen the outcome of your story. Once you've selected this person and work backwards, if this person's a great success, then that's the way your story is going to be. I realized early in China as a writer that you could actually follow people just over real time and kind of move forward with them. And you didn't have to do the kind of back reporting, because things were changing so rapidly that the plot would happen. Like in America, if you were following somebody for 3 years, what are the odds that their lives would radically transform? But in China, it was happening. So that's one reason why I started staying in touch with people and revisiting places and people, because you could get this change, which is something that it probably was partly because of my fiction training that I was very aware of this challenge as a nonfiction writer.
One of the focalizers or lenses through which you observe this change is through your students. Was that a kind of self-conscious decision from very early on that this was the path you wanted to take? Or after you became a teacher, did it just kind of naturally evolve that this was the way to tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some point in Rivertown where I say I joined the Peace Corps and went to China partly because I thought it would make me a better writer. But I didn't go there with the plan of writing about, certainly not the plan of writing a book. I didn't think I was very developed yet. I thought I had a long way to go as a writer. And so that really was not in my mind for most of the time I was there. And so it was more that I thought the experience would help me grow as a writer. But I wasn't really thinking, and actually my first semester, I think I was still writing fiction stories, not about China, just about other stuff. The reason the students, that was the first group of people I was able to connect with, because we were still learning Chinese. The first semester I could not, I couldn't go into town and really have much of a conversation. It wasn't until the second semester that I could start doing that. And whereas with the students, we were immediately thrown into a classroom with 40 to 50 kids, and you have this intense dialogue with them. I did sense quite early on that they were a unique group, because pretty much all of them had come from the countryside. You could really tell that some of them had known poverty, but you could see that they were going somewhere else. They were becoming educated. And once they wrote about their families, and I realized that so many of their parents couldn't even read, that many of their parents had not gone to school at all. And this was remarkable that these kids were going to college. And so I did have a very early sense that these students matter, and probably their whole generation is there's something significant there. But there wasn't anything in my mind that clicked, oh, I'm going to follow these kids for 25 years, But I did start writing I was taking a lot of notes on what they were writing, just because I found it so fascinating. And also we didn't have internet at that time. We didn't have phones. And so you had a lot of time. I was studying Chinese a lot, but I was also teaching very diligently. But then I would process what the students were writing. And so I ended up with these great, notes from my classes, and also from the things that they wrote, because they wrote beautifully. They often had trouble speaking English because they hadn't met a native speaker before, but the writing was remarkable. And of course, it was very intense, the things they were describing and their perspective. And so once I did start to think about writing a book, the material was there actually, but it definitely developed organically. It was not a plan.
If I could, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the craft of writing itself. A moment ago, you mentioned you took classes with people like Russell Banks, Joyce Carol Oates. I know it's difficult to boil that down into a succinct response, but what were some of the greatest lessons you took away from these incredible writers that you then carried forward in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I started, thinking of myself as a fiction writer and writing fiction. And I think it had a big impact on me as a writer in China and as a journalist once I switched over to journalism. I think one of the things that had an impact on me was that as a fiction writer, you tend to think a lot about, obviously you think about plot, but you think a lot about character and setting. And those things are very important when you're writing. In a way, as a journalist, I think you tend to think more about issues, is often the way journalists begin their projects. And I tended to do it differently. So I would often, there was somebody who interested me. Like I had a student named Emily who went to Shenzhen, and she was just one of my most engaging, most thoughtful students. And I probably would have followed her wherever she went in terms of keeping in touch with her. But when she was in Shenzhen as a migrant, and we were exchanging letters and phone calls, she was the starting point for a story that it ended up being a story partly about Shenzhen and about migration, but it began with this person, with this individual. And there were other projects that began with a place. And I think that's the way that a novelist or a short story writer would often think, and different from issues. I feel like sometimes if you start with issues, it can end up being reductive maybe. And maybe then the people that you find or the places you find are only there to serve. There's a risk of that. There's a risk to any approach you take. But I think that was one thing about starting with character in place. So that was very useful. I think also the patience, I took, one thing about writing is it takes so long to develop. I think sometimes we're distracted by examples of very young writers, and we think that that's something that's realistic. You have F. Scott Fitzgerald writing and, classics in his 20s, and Hemingway and people like this. It's extremely rare, actually, and even great writers often are not doing much of value until their 30s or even 40s or even later. And my teacher, John McPhee, told me that many times. You have to be patient. It takes time for a writer to grow. And that was really true. And I think I did come out of university willing to be patient. What I didn't understand fully was that part of that growth is maturity. So when I said I wanted to go to China because it would make me a better writer, I thought I'll learn Chinese and I'll learn about this place. I'll maybe get material. And that was definitely important. That was part of it. But I think actually what was probably at least as important was that it forced me to grow up, because you're one of two foreigners in this pretty remote place, and you're challenged in a way that you had never been challenged before, and it's a very humbling experience to learn Chinese in a place like Fuling, where, people had a dialect, and if you said something, your tones are not good and their tones are not good either, like even if you said, Chifan, right? I mean, they're going to go Cifan, the way they say it there. And you had to learn to, like, Huawei was my name, was Huawei, the way they would say it in Sichuanhua. And so it was just unbelievably difficult at the beginning and very humbling, because people would laugh at you, but that's not a bad experience, for somebody in their 20s, maybe with an Ivy League degree or whatever, to go to this place where you're starting over. But that was really important, I think, to becoming a writer, was that growth that came from that. So I always told my students who wanted to be writers, try to find an experience that really challenges you. Ideally one that gets you material and knowledge and background, but also something that just challenges you personally and makes you grow. And so it's funny, when I started, my teacher, John McPhee, encouraged me to start thinking about writing a book. And I began, and this was toward the very end of my time in Fuling. And I sat and I said, maybe I can write something about this. And when I sat down and started writing the first parts of that book, I was really struck by how different. I could tell my voice was different. Like it's I don't know, it's like you're speaking and suddenly it's a richer, deeper voice or something. I just had more confidence. And that was that maturity, basically. So that process of learning, of growing as a writer, this long, this long process, it's good to be aware of that when you're young, I think.
Sticking with this topic of the craft of writing. You know, one thing that you do so beautifully is you write these pieces, kind of short story length for the New Yorker, and then you write full-length books that are, you know, around 400 pages, and they both work so beautifully. Like you can extract almost any chapter from your book, and it can be a standalone piece, and yet collectively they also work so well as a long-form narrative. Can you talk about that balance between, you know, the magazine piece and then the longer form? And also part of that is your art of juxtapositions. And what I mean by that is in Other Rivers, there's long passages where you juxtapose your earlier group of students from the 90s
Mhm.
and fooling with your current students in Sichuan. There's a period where you're discussing your twin daughter's education, and then you slip out and start talking about their great-grandfather's journey as a student, you know, decades earlier. And there's a really beautiful way you're able to bring together these different narratives from different times, different places, and thread them together. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, to answer the first question, I mean, I think balancing, it used to be easier for New Yorker writers to balance their magazine writing with the book writing because the magazine wrote these incredibly long stories. Like, I mean, John McPhee was my teacher at Princeton, and he had started writing with the New Yorker in the 60s. And so, for most of his career, every word that was in a book had been in the magazine. And they would run these stories that were like 20, 30,000 words. I mean, huge stories. But the New Yorker changed, so you don't do that anymore. So now it's harder, I think, and I almost never have something that goes directly into a book chapter. You know, it's more like I do the New Yorker project first, and then I work on the book. But that interplay is important because, I mean, one reason is it's funding, right? If you're trying to support yourself as a writer, it helps to have your research paid for, which it is if I'm doing it for the New Yorker first. It's also a way to kind of feel out a topic sometimes and to see how it works. And so you try it first at magazine length and then figure it out for the book. But it is no longer, I think, that kind of seamless integration that writers had in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s with the magazine. And my focus has been more on books because I've always felt like books last longer. You have more control as a writer over what you do in a book. So that's kind of my priority. And that's why I don't write a ton for the New Yorker. I mean, people are always asking me, do you still write for the New Yorker? It's been like almost since I started. It's been 25 years now, but I still get this question all the time because there's long stretches if I'm working on a book when I'm not publishing in the magazine. But yeah, this is, you know, and I talked a lot with John, my former teacher. Over the years, we would compare notes on how do you do this and how does this work? Because it's one of these things you have to figure out as a writer. When you talk about the juxtapositions, yeah, I mean, it's just when you start a book and you kind of gather all the material, and I organize it in a way that I can go through it quickly and find and reference things efficiently. And then I start to think about, well, what makes sense next to each other, right? So you talked about, like, when I wrote about my daughter's education, it made sense to bring in some of their family history because that also had a lot to do with education, and in particular, the contrast between China and America in terms of education. I think I also think about juxtapositions and balance in terms of tone as well. So sometimes I try to have humor balance something that may be a little heavy or a little serious. And so I'm very conscious of that too, trying to, you know, periodically have lighter parts of a book, you know, to give a different mood.
Yeah. You, before this book, your previous publication was The Buried, which was inspired by your years as a correspondent in Egypt. It was your first book kind of completely stepping out of China and then exploring another kind of third space. I'm wondering how, having that experience in Egypt and writing that book, The Buried, and then coming back to China, how did that reframe your perspective on China?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's such contrast. I mean, it's amazing because there are certain things that are similar in the sense that, you know, Egypt is Dunya, which means like the mother of the world. That's what they call themselves. You know, it's the center of the world. It's Zhongguo, right? I mean, you know, and so they both of these are very, very strong cultures that they see themselves as the center of their region, of their world. I think of course, the relationship with the past is also part of that connection. These are countries that were countries before people had the idea of what a country really is. And so this sort of the sense of identity is so powerful in both of these places. So that was something that was definitely a connection. But apart from that, there were so many major contrasts. And Leslie and I were always talking about the differences, which would range from, things like the moment, like in Egypt, we were witnessing the revolution, and, there was a first presidential election, the Muslim Brotherhood was elected, and then there was a coup, and, the president's thrown in jail, and there's protests and violence, and I'd never seen anything like this in China, right? Whereas in China, we'd witnessed this amazing sort of economic and social change without a political dimension, and so we were always thinking about that. Well, what is a revolution? What is, because in Egypt, you didn't have that economic improvement. You didn't have the social change. It was still very traditional. So it was really fascinating to sort of think about that and think about what had changed in China and what had not changed, and what are some of the reasons for this. And then just also at the personal level, there were all kinds of funny contrasts, like just the relationship with money was funny, because I mean, one of the things, I think in Rivertown, there's a chapter called Money, and I talk about the way people talked about money, and it was, sometimes it would bother Americans because Chinese would always say, how much money do you make, right? When you were in the 90s, they just ask you that question. And then I realized pretty soon that it's good to answer, because then I can ask them the same thing, and people didn't care, right? And I could learn a lot. And if I told them, because my salary was, like 1,000 like I made only 1,000 kwai and $120, and they'd just be like, wow, you're really not making very much money if you're a foreigner. Like, well, you must be a very low grade foreigner if you're if that's your salary. But it was like money was such an open topic. And it was just easy to talk, and that was a very sensitive thing in Egypt. Like, you had to be, whereas the first question they'd always ask in Egypt in the cab, they'd often second, or, in China, that'd be the first or second question they'd ask, Nisha Laguren, they would ask first, in Sichuan, what country are you from? But then they would ask, how much money do you make? In Egypt, they'd ask the same thing, are you, what country from? But then it would be like, Dinak, which is like, what religion are you? That was like their number 2 question. And Leslie had to learn to say, I'm Christian, even though she's not, because she realized if she said anything else, like, you couldn't say Buddhist, like they just thought that's a joke, from the Egyptian perspective, you only have 3 possibilities, right? So there are all of those kind of things. And then with the money, also the bargaining was a funny adjustment, because in Sichuan, like in the 90s, if you're a Peace Corps volunteer and you have Itian, like, you've got to learn to bargain, because every time you go to buy a bottle of water or anything, they're going to jack up the price. And so you just get really, it's like a sport, basically. And I can remember in the early time in Egypt, I kind of approached it the same way. It's like, oh, this guy's looks like this price is a little high. I'm going to settle in, and we're going to go, really go for it. And I started bargaining with this guy, and then very soon he was like, he just was so clearly frustrated. He's like, La ilaha illallah, which is like, there is no God but God. There is no Allah, no God but Allah. Which is the beginning of the Quran. And it's like something you say if you're trying to control your temper, like he was so frustrated that I was bargaining with him. And I was like, wow, I bargained this guy to the point of prayer. And I realized, like, you can't bring your A game to the bargaining in Egypt. Like, it has to be a little more mellow. So there were lots of adjustments. Like, it was very fun, though, to think about these differences and to sort of play China off a third, so instead of just having the American perspective, to have another culture that's in your mind and in your language.
So we're more or less the same generation. We're both teachers, but you get them at the high school range in China. I kind of get them when they're finally in college and they've made it to the US. And so it's a very different experience. And over the years, I mean, most of the students who take my classes are international students from China, or a good percentage of them are. And over these last 25 years, I've seen some really interesting macro changes from the late 90s to the early 2000s, international students coming in from China who have this incredible thirst for knowledge and curiosity. And of course, those students are mostly scholarship students, because they work really hard to have those opportunities. And then you move a few years forward, we get to the early 2000s, you start getting more privileged students who are self-paying their tuition. They're driving better cars, wearing better clothes, and the curiosity I saw start to disappear for a lot of them. And in fact, there was a period maybe around 2010s, I would see international students coming from China thinking like, this is it? This is America? Like Shanghai's better than this, Beijing's better than this. And in the last couple, I'd say 5 or 6 years, I'm seeing a spark of idealism, curiosity, frustration, a desire for change, starting to come back to this younger generation of students. I'm curious from your end, seeing the students at the high school level in China, what are the macro trends that you've observed over your career as a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I never taught high school actually, so they're university, but yeah, kind of fresh out of high school. It's different because I was not teaching straight through like you, so I kind of have these two windows a generation apart, because 96 to 98 I taught in Fuling for 2 years, and then 2019 to 2021 at Chuanda, Sichuan University. And those are, as anybody from China would know, those are not equivalent universities. You know, Chuanda is one of the top 35 or so universities. Jiubawu University, and Fuling when I was there was what they called like it wasn't even a undergraduate, it wasn't a BA degree. But actually at that time only 8% of Chinese could go to any kind of college, so it was actually pretty hard to get into even that place, whereas Chuanda was like 2% or 3%. So in some ways it's not totally out of the ballpark. I think that there's a lot of, I mean, for me, that because of that gap of time, it's different. You're seeing this trying to kind of continuum, but for me, it's like these amazingly different snapshots. I mean, all of those kids were rural. More than 90% of the students in Fuling had grown up in the countryside, big families, often like pretty close to poverty, often the first people in their village to go to college. And then in Chuanda, that first semester I taught, I did not have one student who had grown up in the countryside. They were all city kids, and more than 90% of them were only children, which was extremely rare when I taught in Fuling. So you have these kind of, the city versus the countryside. There's a part in Rivertown where I talk about how the students seemed very young, like they seemed like children in a way. Often they seemed very childlike. And Adam was the other teacher there. We were always kind of reminding ourselves, like, this is deceptive. Like, these are not like young people who are, they're just, because they're coming from the countryside, they're making this transition. They're a little bit overwhelmed in some ways, and they may present themselves as, for what they may seem young to us, and they weren't particularly informed, but they had been through a lot, right? I mean, they had often seen pretty tough things in their villages. It had been very hard for them to get to the university, but they seemed young. And then I talked about in the new book with the students at Chuanda, I realized after a couple of semesters that it was the opposite. They felt kind of old to me. They felt, part of it was knowledge, like they knew a lot. They knew how the system worked. They were quite savvy. Those kids from the countryside, and later when I would do surveys with them, they often wrote about, they're like, my parents could tell me nothing. There was no advice they could give me once I went to college. And one kid wrote, I remember one of my surveys, they raised us like they raised pigs and chickens. That was the perspective. And so it was a very different relationship with the parent, whereas the Sichuan University kids, they were very close to their parents as only children, but also they were in the same world. Their parents were already urban people, and they were teaching them things about how the world worked. They would often, so they would know how to deal with petty corruption already, or they would know, I remember one kid telling me, yeah, my dad's been teaching me how to drink at banquets, because he was like from Zhejiang, and his dad was a factory owner. And it's like, this is something the kids got to know how to do. And so we're going to train, him. And so they were just, they presented kind of older and a little more, I wouldn't say, cynical is sort of a negative word, but just more knowing, more aware. So I think that was a big difference, something that really jumped out at me.
And besides the shift in students, can you talk about how your own approach to teaching shifted between those two windows? And maybe even if we could be a little creative, kind of take us inside He-Wei's classroom. What kind of techniques did you use working with students? You talk about using Animal Farm in 1984 and these kind of texts to work with them, which is kind of ironic that the school provided these books. But what other books, essays, readings were you assigning? How did you, we always talk about the stereotypical Chinese educational system being very much rooted in memorization and less creativity. Were there things that you were doing to challenge that and create a more creative and dynamic environment for the students?
Yeah, so that when I first in Fooling, it was a lot of what you were dealing with was problems with materials. Like it was very hard to get materials. We didn't have internet access, and it wasn't like we didn't know what we were teaching until we were sent to the school. And then you had to figure out, and sometimes they had these texts that were crazy. Like we were supposed to teach a class on American culture, and it had this whole chapter that was basically about homosexuality being a big problem in America and how capitalism causes people to be gay and just like this crazy, awful stuff. And you're like, what am I going to do with this, right? I can't put this in front of these kids. And Adam tried to tell them that this is all wrong. And they're like, no, I think this makes sense. The kids. And so you had to find other materials. Like we were constantly trying to find ways to teach. So some of the things I did came out of that. Like I think I wrote about in Rivertown, like I did Shakespearean sonnets, and I'd cut up the sonnet and then give them a rhyme scheme, and then they would have to try to put it together in the right order. And I'd kind of give hints and so I did things like that probably because that's a way to take a very simple thing and make it into a longer lesson. So a lot of it had to do with the materials. And you're also figuring out how things were different in a Chinese classroom. Like if you called on a kid, first of all, you couldn't really depend on people just to raise their hand and answer a question like you would in America, because nobody wanted to talk, right? And then if you called on the kid, and the kid stands up and they're like, oh, not unhappy, and they don't know the answer, then their neighbor would be whispering the answer, And there were some of the Peace Corps people, we were all pretty young, they would get so frustrated by that, and they would and I realized like these kids are in the classroom together all the time. Like they have a very different relationship than a class of American students. Like they're almost like siblings in a way. And they're going to help out their friend, right? So it's like, maybe I just shouldn't do that anymore. Like you can't put them on the spot in the same way. So that was part of the process that first semester, was learning some of these things that you think of as very basic in an American classroom, you just can't do. But there are other things that work great. So you had to be very resourceful at that moment. When you talk about Sichuan University, was of course completely different in terms of materials, because I could access anything. And as you said, Animal Farm was distributed to all my freshman students. So I was like, yeah, I'm perfectly happy to teach this. And Orwell's great to teach because his language is so clear. So I also taught some of his essays, like Shooting an Elephant and A Hanging, like these kind of classic essays. And that was really great to teach from. But one of the things that I did that I really pushed at Chuanda was actually for all of my classes, I had my students do outside research projects. And I think, my kids are in school as ninth graders now, and Leslie and I were talking about this the other day, that like, it is actually one of the most useful things that any student can do at a level of education is to start to do journalism, actually. My daughters are starting to do reporting in the community, because you have to learn to talk to people, to ask questions, to ask follow-up questions, to communicate, to structure. Like it is a really good experience. And I felt like in China in particular, in the high school system, the kids tend to be just so focused on the Gaokao and being in the classroom and studying, like they have limited contact with the outside. And I wanted them to get outside. So I've had all of my students, and sometimes they resisted, but once they were so hardworking that once they became clear that you've got to do this, they did a great job with it. But I feel like that's part of the Chinese education system that's lacking, was this sort of contact with society, with real life. And I thought if I could do that as a teacher, that's good for them.
So we first corresponded because of Fei Fang. And Fei Fang is a Wuhan-based writer who during the early stage of COVID-19 wrote a lockdown diary, which went viral. I was the translator of that, and Peter visited Wuhan and was not only the first, but the only Western journalist to speak to her. And the reason she spoke to Peter is because she said, he's not a journalist, he's a writer. And so there was a moratorium of her not speaking to foreign media, but because Peter's a writer, that was her workaround. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that experience, meeting Fei Fang in Wuhan during the height of this COVID crisis, and also maybe some more general reflections about living through that period in China.
Yeah, so I met her in, I guess that was August of 2020. So Wuhan, of course, was locked down. And we're all aware of the lockdowns that happened later in China. But that first phase, I think the memory is kind of, people sort of forget this, but Wuhan, of course, was locked down in a totally different way than the rest of China. So we were in Chengdu, And we did have what we were calling a lockdown, but in fact, we could leave anytime we wanted our apartment. You could walk around. Most people did not because people were afraid. And so there were very few people in the streets. But it wasn't like later where they had these really, really strict, doors were taped shut and so on. But Wuhan had been through something totally different than the rest of China. And of course, that was also where the disease blew up, and almost all of the fatalities in that early wave were focused on Wuhan. So they had sort of suffered and experienced something that none of the rest of us had. Like, before I went to Wuhan in August of 2020, I did not know one person who had been infected with COVID, other than people in America. I mean, the first person I knew got infected was my literary agent in New York. He was infected in March or whatever. But no Chinese, nobody I knew in China. And actually, I was surveying my classes that I was teaching, and none of them knew anybody personally either. So it was still extremely rare at that time to know somebody who had COVID. So it was a weird thing because this thing had exploded all over the world. But for almost all of us in China, it was still kind of abstract, and going to Wuhan was really amazing because suddenly it was real. And you talking to people, I met people who had it or people who had been close to people who had it. And it gave me a different perspective. And of course, that city was something like an island, right, at the time, and that the way it was isolated from the rest of China, and their experience was totally different from the rest of China. So it was it was a good moment to be there because for a couple of reasons. One, I think that people had been through this trauma and they were kind of ready to process it. I found them very thoughtful and very open, actually. I had really good conversations there. I was very, impressed by the way people were talking about it. They seemed eager to talk about it, which I hadn't necessarily expected. I think the other thing that was good is I think maybe the police were tired. And I say that as a joke, but I think it may have been true because I told my editors I'm going to go to Wuhan and they may kick me out after a day or two. But I'll just see what happens. And it was amazing because I didn't have any police. And I went to the Huanan market where it first spread, and I went to the upstairs part of that and talked to people. And I did see like BIE, the plainclothes guys, like I could see people were plainclothes, and a couple of them noticed me, but nobody ever asked me a question. I don't think I was actually being followed because there were some people I met several times. And if you're in a place and you meet people the first time, sometimes the next time you call, they're like, oh, I'm busy, or, you can kind of get the vibe that they've been talked to. And that didn't seem to be happening. And I talked to a number of people afterward, and I think it may have been that exhaustion, like it may have been that the police, like so many people had been overworked and were just not as attentive as usual. So it was a good moment to be there. And I did meet with Fei Fang, and I kind of thought she'd want to meet in a very quiet, private place. And the thing that was funny is we went to this very cool, bustling, there was like a, cafe, and got a table prominently. And I sat across from her and we talked, and people were coming up and saying hi to her. One thing that it gave me was a strong sense of her community there. And there were other people I met throughout Wuhan, people who were kind of part of the intellectual community and community of writers and artists who were very supportive of her. And I realized that was part of how she survived the attacks, because she did have people there who cared for her and who supported her. And that this is kind of, I think, characteristic of provincial China in difficult political times, that people band together and they try to support each other. And even if they can't publish, they're gathering and talking about things. Now, I was in a couple of meetings like that in Wuhan that were quite interesting, where people, and they were talking about the political climate, not just COVID, but also the larger political climate in this more repressive time that we were in. So yeah, I felt very fortunate to be able to go there. And I felt a lot of sympathy for what people had gone through, and I admired them for their willingness to talk about it. And in some ways, the very clear way that they had, at that stage, at least, the way they talked about it, I felt was very, very clear-headed. Yeah.
You mentioned the online violence. You also were targeted, and you also were were reported on, which caused a lot of complications professionally for your teaching, and eventually, pushing you out of that position. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how you navigated this, because this form of online violence is increasingly pervasive, not just in China, but everywhere. And what did you draw upon to rise up and to face it, and just your approach to being put in that kind of a position.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have the nothing like the intensity that Fei Fang had or that you had, to be honest. So I was never targeted into that degree. But it is something you're aware of, and you mentioned jubal, which means to be report or to report, and Bei jubal. That is something that as a teacher you're aware of, right? It's not that common actually, but it's the threat of it weighs on people, and it tends to shape behavior. And there was an incident at the end of my first semester where I was not formally reported to the university, but things were put out on social media that made it look like I had been. And it was a little scary because you could see how this could push to eventually being reported or to having trouble. And you could see this was one way to build some negative energy against a writer or a teacher. And in that case, it came out of something that I'd written, actually a comment on a student's paper, that then, just an editing comment, because my students would do drafts and I would give them feedback and then they would edit. And some things from this editing comments ended up on social media, but totally twisted in a way that made it look like I had been in a class, right, was kind of lecturing my students on American media being superior and on just like a very anti-China approach that I was giving as a teacher, as a lecturer, which was completely inaccurate. But there are little bits of it that I could tell where they had come from. This, from a student's paper. I knew which student. And so yeah, it's very scary when this kind of thing happens. And the reaction was from the university was not to try to figure this out. Like that was not the reaction. It was like, well, let's talk to the student and see what happened. Like that was not at all what anybody wanted to do. They wanted it to blow over. Which was interesting too, right? Because they were just as afraid. And I realized that the administrators are they got fear in both directions. One is the students, who they're a little bit of, all authoritarian countries are always afraid of young people, right? This is a standard everywhere in the world. And they're afraid of the students getting onto something, even if it's like very nationalistic and pro-China and causing trouble. They're also afraid of their higher ups. So they've got a fear in both directions, and they just want this thing to go. And when I talked to other people who had been formally reported, they had described it as the same way. And my interest in some ways was the same, because I'd been there for a semester, well, not even quite a full semester, and my kids were just settling into the school, and I didn't want to have to leave, basically. And so I didn't talk to that student until much later, until actually after I went back to the US. It was just left unresolved. And I realized this must just go on all the time. There must be so many of these little flare-ups that scare people and then disappear. You never hear about them. Mine was more public because I was a writer, but I think it just, these little reminders are there. Yeah.
And you're living, this is all taking place, of course, during the COVID.
But this was right before.
Right before COVID.
Yeah, that was right before.
But then the other parallel thing you're living through is the breakdown in Sino-US relations, which are kind of unraveling in real time before your eyes as an American writer and teacher going through that. And your family, your children are in a Chinese school. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that shift as it was taking place? You were one of the few foreign journalists in China during this period.
Yeah, I mean, this even right before COVID hit. I mean, COVID was actually already hitting, but before it had locked everybody down. The Trump administration decided to end the Peace Corps program in China. Not a COVID-related decision, but just for political reasons, which is really unprecedented. There's not a tradition of ending Peace Corps programs for diplomatic reasons. It's supposed to be separate from politics. And they ended the Fulbright program. And, the Americans expelled a bunch of Chinese journalists, and the Chinese expelled a bunch of journalists, a bunch of American journalists. So all this stuff was going on. And of course, the closing of the consulate in Houston, the Chinese consulate, and then they closed the consulate in Chengdu. We knew a lot of people there. We'd spent a lot of time. That was our city. So those things we were really very much aware of that. And there were very few Americans left by the end of our first year. And my daughter, we had gone there. One of the reasons we wanted to be in Chengdu was so that my daughters could go to a Chinese school and learn Chinese. They didn't speak Chinese when they showed up. And they went to Chengdu Shiyan Xiaoxue, which is like a Chengdu experimental school very good school. The administration was great about allowing them in. There were no other Western students, no Americans, and they let my daughters be dropped into a Chinese class, and they mainstreamed them, basically, something that's not that common in China. And after COVID hit, I was kind of thinking that the school might ease them out. Like that was like, it's a risk, right? It just seems like to have these foreigners and the children of foreign writers there, Americans, not just foreigners. And it was interesting. And then the girls came back a couple of times because there was so much anti-American stuff in the news, and they said some of the boys had been saying like "Da dao mei bo, da dao mei," like down with America. And Les and I said, yeah, there's going to be a little bit of this. There's a lot of negative news, and things aren't going that well in the US right now. Just try to ignore it. And fortunately, most of the kids have been nice to you. And, so we didn't say anything, but it was interesting because 2 days after that, when they went back to, I guess that was a Friday, and they went back to school the Monday, and their teacher, who was this kind of wonderful classic Chinese teacher, their Yuan Lao, the language teacher, she gave the kids a talk, and she talked about Elon Musk had sent up a satellite. And Elon Musk was seen a little differently than he might be seen now. But anyway, she told this story about, they had this successful satellite launch, and he's an immigrant. He came to America because of education, and they have a very strong education system. And this is something that happens when you study well. And then she said, at the end of it, she said, in every country has its good points and its bad points. And that was her, very tactful way of sort of dealing with this and putting something else in front of the kids. And we hadn't spoken to her about, she was very sensitive, so the school, that meant a lot to us. I could tell that they protected them, it was very decent. The politics did not, and as I say it toward the end of the book, the politics ended up infecting my job at Sichuan University and infected many parts of our lives. But the kids' education, it was the one place that it never happened. The education was about something else to them. And the other parents and the other kids, I mean, what was funny was the second year, my daughters had good Chinese, and then I'd go to pick up the kids, and the parent would bring over her kid and be like, "Look at Zhou and Cai Cai, 他们的中文一定比你的好," and they just would lay into the kids, why look at these kids, they just came from America last year, their Chinese is already better than yours, and they just and I was just like, oh my God, please don't do this, this is awful. But you just imagine if during COVID, if you had a class of Americans and there's one Chinese kid there, and you're using that Chinese kid to criticize all the Americans, how would that have gone over? Think about all the Asian hate stuff that was going on. But it said something about this other side of Chinese tradition, and especially education, right? I mean, that's what mattered, was the education to them. Didn't matter if they're American or not. So that was a nice thing. I mean, it was during a very difficult period. We were very grateful for that.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then as promised, we're going to turn it to the audience and your questions to start thinking about what you want to ask Peter. And this is kind of developing from the previous question about the tension between China and the US. We know the trade war started under Donald Trump's first term. He's coming back very soon. He already is suggested or put forward Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, who is an individual with very hawkish stance on China. And I think the general sense is that we're gearing up for even more turbulent waters moving forward when it comes to Sino-US relationship. And so for journalists, for academics, for average students who hoping for more civil engagement with China, not based on black and white binaries, name calling, demonization, what advice do you have about how to navigate this period moving forward and to maintain productive ties, engagement during what inevitably is going to be a period of very radical shifts between these two countries?
Yeah, I mean, it is, of course, dispiriting. And it's also dispiriting that I think that during the Biden administration, there wasn't much done to improve this. And there obviously could have been. And I think there was this fear that you'd get targeted as being soft on China, right? If they tried to, even something like restarting the Fulbright, or, it's very, I think, demoralizing in a way. So I think, yeah, this is not a situation any of us who were involved in in these two countries is happy about, basically. And I mean, I'm glad that there are still lots of Chinese students coming to the US. I hope that they feel welcome enough to stay and to continue to learn about this place. I really wish we had more American students going over there. I think this is a big problem. And a lot of, for our generation, we were talking about this earlier, you kind of stumbled into China. It wasn't something that you thought about early, and I did the same thing. That's not happening anymore. Like, people are not randomly showing up in China the way so many people of our age did. We built a whole group of, whole like body of China experts came out of these random backgrounds. They ended up there because there was opportunity, there was openness, there was energy, and it attracted us and it held us. And it has to be much more intentional now. So I feel like universities have to try to figure out ways to have the infrastructure to send people, to encourage students, to build people who want to go to China. It's one reason my daughters have kept up their Chinese. We'll try to find a way for them to do something either in China or Taiwan next summer but it's important to us. It's important to them. They want it. And I think this is actually a great moment to be studying Chinese in a way, because there's going to be opportunity, because we're not making enough experts. And we're going to need that. So yeah, I mean, but it is something I think all of us are thinking about a lot. Yeah. But I think there needs to be infrastructure, basically, ways, scholarships, programs, things that encourage people to go over there.
Great. Thank you, Peter. So our second part of this event is the audience questions. And I guess I'll walk around like Phil Donahue with the microphone if you have a question.
You probably
But
don't know who Phil Donahue is, though, right?
maybe not. But I'd like to, I know, do we have some high school students here from Geffen? Where are you guys? Raise your hand. I want to get, it's pretty rare we get high school students coming to our events. I want to prioritize first. Do any of our high school students have questions for Peter Hessler? Anything? All right, let's start with the students.
What do you think was the most interesting thing about coming back to the US? And did you learn anything from basically, how have your experiences in China changed your perspective of the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it fundamentally changed the way I see the US. Especially, the first time I was in China, I was there for 11 years. So it was a long stretch before I came back. And my wife had also been away for a long time. I mean, I think that value for education is something that I admired in China and that I sometimes miss in the US. I think the US has a great higher education system. If you're at a university like this, it's remarkable, and there's really nothing like it in the world in terms of the US system. And there are lots of good schools in cities. I'm sure where you guys are going to school is great. But if you're at like an average public school in an average American city, kids do not work the way they do at an average Chinese school in an average Chinese city. There's a big difference. Like, I was always struck because a lot of my students teach in provincial China. They're in small towns in Sichuan or small cities in Sichuan, kind of third and fourth tier cities, not famous schools. They might not have a lot of resources, but the kids are working really hard. And I sort of wish sometimes we had a little more of that in the US. I respect that value and would like to see more of it. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going to have time for more questions, but Peter had a few images, and I think we finally got here.
Yeah, I can show.
Do you want to show us a couple of?
Yeah, I can show a few. Is there a mic up there?
You could just use this hand.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, just to sort of contextualize some of this, I was going to show, since we were talking about, these are just sort of some images from the old days in Fuling teaching there. In the classroom in 1996. Yeah, and so that I talked about that earlier, how in 1996, only 1 out of every 12 Chinese, 8%, was able to go to college, basically. It was very rare at that time. And these were the students I was teaching in that first semester in 1996. When I would show this picture to my students at Chuanda, they would kind of laugh because I'm so tall. This was a different era, and the students were small. They were physically small. Because they had grown up in the countryside under, with pretty limited nutrition. And that was something I really noticed when I went back. That year that most of them had been born, China's population was 83% rural, so that was really common for Chinese at that time. You can notice that, so they all had English names that they had chosen. That's Jimmy with the Bulls. Everybody wore Chicago Bulls, the Bumio Dui, because of Jordan, so Jordan, that was the Jordan era. Kathy, this was one of our class monitors, and all of them chose English names. His name was Mo. In those days, you wore the suit coat with you keep the tailor's label on the sleeve. Actually, Mo is not a smoker, but because Deng Xiaoping always took pictures with cigarettes, that a lot of the boys would pose with them like that. So that was just a pose. And after at some point, some of the students said, well, why is it that you have a real name like Huawei, like you have a Chinese Xing, you have a real family name, but we just have our first name. So then they started, like there was a kid named Willie who became William Foster. And then he became William Jefferson Foster. And then there was a kid named George, and I started to get papers from George Baker Frost. There are all these like very waspy names. I don't know how they came up with them, but that was, Mo became Mo Money. That was his last name. But you did, often it wasn't until later that I realized kind of how challenging their lives have been, because they didn't talk about it that much. There was a boy named David who wrote me a letter in 2017, so 30 years after he'd been in my classroom. He wrote me a letter apologizing that he had not been a very good student. Which he wasn't like he was a bad student, but I did remember he was often a little listless and sometimes would fall asleep in class. And one of the things he said was, for 3 years, I did not eat and sleep well. I remember in 1996, for half a year, I just had one meal a day. I was a sad man, but now I'm happy about my life. So often it wasn't until later that we sort of realized some of the challenges that these young people faced. And sometimes the most basic challenge of all, just getting enough food. And so I often, going back to Sichuan, I did that physicality as a teacher, like you have this contact, and especially when you're in a small classroom with 50 kids, you are very aware of their physical presence. And one of the things that I also realized was it was very easy to learn names, partly because the names were kind of crazy. Like I had a boy named Daisy, he's the one in the camouflage suit up there. But also because they wore the same clothes every day. So you just, like, I knew Lucy had that bright blue sweater, like, I just, you would remember it because they had very few possessions, and also they had to wash everything by hand. And so they would wear the same clothes. And they got chilblains in the winter. Anybody who taught in China, it's not really that cold in Sichuan, right? It doesn't get below freezing. But if it's nothing's heated, and the kids, their dorms are not, like, they're never heated, and they're washing with cold water, and they'd get these sores on their fingers, chilblains on their ears. It also was connected partly to nutrition. And of course, the land that they had come from was very familiar to us, because right outside the gates, this is what the landscape looked like. We were right in the edge of the countryside. If I walked outside the gates of the college, people were farming rice in this very traditional way, with water buffalo. And so you were very aware of the countryside in a way that I think you're not now in most Chinese places. These are pictures. This is from above the college. And this is looking at the Yangtze River is coming this way, and that's the Wu River. Fuling's at the juncture of these two rivers. When I look at these old pictures, one thing that really jumps out at me, of course, is the pollution, right? I mean, most of them have that kind of gray tint to them because the air was so bad. I mean, we didn't have pollution index, so I have no idea what it was, but I know that it was worse in Fuling than it was in Beijing, even in the early 2000s, when Beijing was kind of notorious. It was even worse in a place like this because they were burning very cheap coal. The heavy industry was still in the center of town. Another thing that I noticed about this picture and look back at it is
all the boats, there's boats here, and docks up there. The rivers were full of life at that time. That was the only way you could get anywhere. Like from Fuling to the biggest city was Chongqing. That took 8 hours on the ferry. There was no railroad, no highway. So that sense of isolation was a big part of it. This is looking down on the city from across the Yangtze. And one thing that is kind of striking in this picture is you could see this is 1996. There's some white buildings. There's some, construction is happening at that time. Those are new buildings, the ones that are white. So the development had started to happen in Fuling. It was still in the early stages. But if you look down on the river, you notice there's nothing new in the lower band. And that's because the Three Gorges Dam was being constructed downstream. And Fuling was pretty far upstream, so it was not going to be totally flooded, but the river was going to wipe out that lower part of town. So when you get down past a certain level, nobody was improving anything because they knew the water was coming. And there was no point in building down there. And it was interesting, when you took a boat down the river, you'd see that band, and it would get higher with every town as you went downstream, because the water was going to be higher, until you got to places like Wushan, where they were building an entirely new city. And then all of old Wushan would have no new construction. It was all just kind of falling apart. So this was a sort of an odd thing, because people didn't talk about it very much, even though it was on the horizon. And when you walked in Fuling, in that lower part of town, you would see these signs periodically. And that was where the water level was going to be. So they had these signs in the town. But it was amazing how little people talked about it, because they had to just focus on today, basically, at this time. There was enough that they were adjusting to, that they were dealing with. Yeah, this is another view looking down the river. That you can see that little line in the middle of the river. That was a strip of sandstone that was called the Baiheliang, the White Crane Ridge. And this was it would appear only in the winter when the river dropped, and this would be exposed. And back in the 700s, somebody carved 2 fish in there, images of 2 fish into the stone, and they used it as a water gauge. So when boatsmen were going downstream, they could stop there and look at the 2 fish and see where the water was in relation to them, and they would know what the rapids would be like downstream. And so then they started carving character. It became a tradition to carve inscriptions onto this stone. And the first dated inscription was 765 during the Tang Dynasty. But then people would go and they'd carve calligraphy and poems, and there were more than 300,000 characters that were carved on that rock. And it was a really neat thing to see, because you go out there only in the winter, and there was this guy named Huang Dejian, who was from the local antiquities bureau, who kind of managed it, and he'd sit out there, and it was really cold, out there in the river. And he'd have usually a PLA, one of those heavy coats that you could get, PLA surplus coats. You'd take a little sampan out there, and he knew all of the inscriptions, and he would show them to us. But you're also very aware this was going to be under 300 feet of water. And so, my last year in Fuling, there was an article in the local paper. I was reading the paper for class, and there was an article about what they were going to do with this. And the article said there were 2 proposals. One was to build an underwater museum, and the other was to make a bunch of rubbings of all the inscriptions before they were flooded for the last time, and put them in some kind of gallery. I wrote in Rivertown that they were undoubtedly going to do the second one, because the region didn't have the sort of resources necessary to build an underwater exhibition chair. I remember talking about this with my tutor, who was from the Chinese department in the college. He said, this is absurd. They're not going to they can't build an underwater museum here. This is a poor place. And they always propose these things and promise these things, and it never happens. The only person who was positive about it was Huang Dejian, the guy who was out there. Let me see. Yeah. So, and then, so after I left Fuling, I mentioned earlier how I kept in touch with all these students. Initially, it was all letters, because nobody had phones, nobody had email, and I lived in Beijing as a journalist, and we would write these letters back and forth. And then eventually we moved to email and to phones. And I started at some point to kind of systematize it, in that I would ask survey questions every year, because they had read my books and my stories, and we had a high level of trust, and I could learn more about their lives. And I would ask them again, you could always ask about money. You know, when they started, their annual salary is about $500. 2014, when I surveyed them, it had risen to 18,000. 2021, 35,000. Just this year, when I did it again, it was more than 37,000. So there's sort of amazing rapid, these were all teachers, amazingly rapid improvement in their lives that you could see. You could see it's kind of, now it's sort of slowed down. You know, and they sort of report that as well. That's more money there on the left. But they, you know, and when you see them now, they look, you know, they're all urban. You know, all of them became urban people, right? I mean, this is not like, you know, not straight off the farm. But then going to teach in Sichuan, one of the things that was amazing to me was that 8% turned into 51.6% of young Chinese now go to college. So they passed through all 3 stages of education in one generation, which I think is really unprecedented, and especially for a large place. And you could see this like at the Fuling level. You know, when I left, there were 2,000 students, and 6 years later, they expanded to 20,000. Just, you know, it's really unbelievable. And to be honest, to do that without creating instability is also kind of remarkable. That's something else when you asked about Egypt. One of the things that destabilized Egypt in the 70s was they rapidly expanded the university system without a corresponding economic growth, which meant that students go to campus, they start to build big dreams, and then they're frustrated and they can't find anything. And that's what the Islamist movements came out of that. They were all on those campuses. The Gamat Islamiyah, the one that was famous for the really violent, they were all, that became their breeding grounds. So there was, you know, it's a hard thing for an authoritarian system to do. And you realize that this expansion happened as that economic growth was happening. Those young people could go to college and get jobs. I often think about this now though, right? I mean, there's young people in China are this 51%, they're highly educated, and the economic opportunities are not the same as they were. And that's something I think about a lot, like where does that go? The other thing I noticed being back, I talk about the physicality of students. You know, all these kids are taller than me. So, you know, I would always joke to them, like, I've gotten a lot shorter. But, you know, this was a study in 2020 in the Lancet. Out of 200 countries, China has seen the largest increase in boys' height, the 3rd largest in girls since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male is more than 3.5 inches taller. All right. So this is, again, one of these things that this improvement that we saw in the material conditions can seem very abstract, but when you're there in person, this really hits home. The difference in the city. So when I went back to Fuling, I would often try to go to the same spot and take pictures to see how the landscape had changed. Of course, the connections changed, right? That 8 hours became 38 minutes on a high-speed train. So it was much easier for me to get back there when I taught at Chengdu. You notice there the rivers widened, much more development, all the high buildings. There's a bridge there that wasn't there. Of course, the air is dramatically different, all right? When you look at these pictures, you no longer have the pollution, and look at all the boats, they're gone. All right, nobody uses the river anymore. There used to be all of these boat noises that were part of my environment there, and now it's just kind of silent. That's very striking. And these fields, right? Those terraced fields that I had pictures of, these patchworks when the ground was worked so carefully when most of the population was rural. Now most of those fields are overgrown. And there's no longer those rice terraces that I showed the image of. People don't farm rice there anymore. It takes too much labor, and all the young people have left. And when you walk through the countryside, a lot of the paths I used to walk on are overgrown, and almost the few residents who are left are mostly elderly people, often just growing like household vegetables, not really serious crops. So that's, you know, really striking. Also just the trees, you notice in the picture on the right, when I tried to go back and take pictures of those farmland, I often couldn't find I couldn't recognize the same spot. I couldn't find it because the terrain had changed so much. So it's almost like this physical change you see in the students as they get bigger and with more nutrition. There was also a corresponding, even the landscape had this sort of radical transformation where you can hardly recognize things. And sometimes you would notice things like when I went back to this picture, again, that band of brown was gone and replaced. There's a dike that's along the water there. But one thing, when I went back and took this, I noticed that temple. And then when I looked at the old picture, and I hadn't noticed that when I lived there in the 90s, but you could see that this was rubble. And so I assumed that, this had been torn down and rebuilt. And I went back there, and yeah, it was a Taoist temple. And I sort of assumed it had been torn down in the Cultural Revolution. But when I talked to people in the area, I found some older people and talked to them. They said actually it had been torn down in the Great Leap Forward, because people had been starving and they wanted to sell anything they could find for scrap. So there are little bits of history that you would, that you recognize. Of course, when I went to the new one that was rebuilt, there was no inscription about what its history was. Nothing even to say that it had been destroyed. So all of that kind of, this sort of political, you choose what it is you remember. The other thing you notice in this picture, of course, there's the White Crane Ridge, and here it's 300 feet underwater. When you go back to that dike, that part on there's no history exhibit with the temple, but when you go on that and walk on that dike, which is kind of like a bund, like the Shanghai White on the bund, they do have these historical exhibits there. And these are things from like the early 2000s. And this was one of the inscriptions. In 2005, they closed this pier, and the site retained some relics and equipment to commemorate those who contributed to the economic construction and development of Fuling. So the thing they wanted to remember was, the early years of the Reform era. They were not going to remember that temple that had been taken down. When you go on to into that, and the dike, there's this new museum there. You go in the museum, and there's an escalator that goes for 300 feet. And you get down to the bottom of the escalator, and they have these kind of portholes that are like what you'd have in a submarine. And you look out, and you can see the inscriptions on the White Crane Ridge. So that underwater museum that had seemed so ridiculous, they ended up building it at a cost of, I think it was $35 million. And we think about that change. When I was there, this day, January 30th, 1998, the water level was 2 inches higher than it had been in 765 from the fish. And then in 12 years, you have this whole thing under 300 feet of water with this underwater museum. And then you go in the museum, and the director of the museum is the same guy that used to sit out on the rock. So like this guy used to sit out there, and he was the only one who told me, yeah, well, they're going to build the museum. I was like, this is crazy. They're not going to build a museum. But sure enough, he was the director. And I remember visiting him, like this Adam and I were visiting him, and he had like 2 cell phones, and there's pictures of him with every government official who's visited, and he's become this like important gambu, it's like. And so it's part of the funny thing about going back is you have this incredible change, but certain things are exactly the same. It's like the same guy there, they just he's still doing basically the same job. It's just now he's in charge of a museum that's like $40 million. So anyway, those are just some images I think to kind of help contextualize a bit what this sort of looks like going back there as, as a teacher, as an observer. But yeah, any other questions anybody has about anything that we did?
Couple of questions, if I may. The first is, when I was in China about 15, 20 years ago, I noticed the friendliness of everybody to a foreigner. And I wonder if that's continued with the change of political situation between our 2 countries. And then the second one is, could you say a bit more about your children's education in China and how it's affected them later on, whether they're very well prepared, etc., etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the first, it was funny to be there at that time because I did not feel any unfriendliness on the street. And it was interesting that during COVID, there was a little bit in the initial period when people, when things were bad in Wuhan and they just closed down in Chengdu, there was definitely a period when people were very wary of any stranger and were scared. And like, I remember a couple times getting in the elevator and people getting out or they turned their back to me. There was sort of that.
but that period passed pretty quickly. Like the first time we went to a restaurant was March 8th, 2020. I wrote about it in the New Yorker. And basically by that point, the disease had been put down in Chengdu. And after that, our lives were very normal. And one thing that was striking to me was during that period, the mood on the street was pretty relaxed, actually, because you couldn't really catch the disease in China in 2020 after that first wave had been put down. It wasn't until Omicron much later that it became, then I think people's behavior changed. So you realize the pressure that people felt has a big impact on how they, and also how much xenophobia you feel, right? Because during this time, there was a lot of it in America. There was a lot of targeting of Asian people. And I did not have the equivalent as a foreigner. Even though they knew that the disease was much more common overseas, they kind of knew that if I was there, I had either been through quarantine or I'd been there throughout. So I didn't feel that personally. So it says a lot about, one of the costs of not managing a pandemic well is that you do get people, people are scared and they're going to target, others. In terms of our daughter's education, yeah, that was a big part of our reason for going there. And it took a huge amount of energy because, as I said, they didn't speak Chinese. And the first day when I picked them up from school, they were both crying and they said, we can't go back. We can't do this. And I said, no, we're going to go back. And it was amazing how quickly they could learn. At that age, they were 9. And like, even within a couple of days, you could see them settling in a bit. And within about a month, they were understanding a lot, and by the end of that first semester, they really could kind of understand everything. By the end of the first year, they could read and write at, grade level. It was totally normal. So it was a great part of the experience. It had a big impact on them. It's sort of, these are third graders. They were in third grade, and at semester, you would have a midterm, a final examination. It was 100 minutes for Chinese, 90 minutes for math, 90 minutes for science, 90 minutes for English. These are third graders, And in my book, I say it reminds, because I'm a distance runner, it reminds me of like training endurance athletes, right? This is all teaching them to focus for the Gaokao. This is early preparation. But I noticed that with my kids, like they're very good at this. Like they can lock in for long periods of time because you have to do that in a Chinese classroom. So it had a big impact. I think it was the right amount of time. So I think if they had been in there for longer, there was some cost to it. One of them was physical. Again, this kind of physicality is a funny thing to think about because I did notice like my kids needed more physical activity than they were getting because kids study so much. And actually, in my recent survey, I asked my Fuling students, I asked them a couple questions. One was like what about your child? And most of their children are about the same age as the kids I taught at Sichuan University. When I asked them, what quality about your children makes you most proud, the quality that you most admire? He has no quality. This is the kind of response that I often think of as, like, even though my students are not rural people anymore, sometimes they talk just like what I think of rural Chinese, like very direct, there's like no euphemisms. It's just, this is what it is. She showed great interest and talent studying. He likes eating bitter. He likes studying though he's tired. They're very, and I agreed with this. They said she is not spoiled at all. It was striking to me that the students I taught at Sichuan University, even though they're only children, and the students that my daughters were in school with, who were only children as well, were not spoiled kids. They were prosperous often. They had plenty of money. They weren't like the kids in the 90s, but they were still, you have to work so hard in a Chinese school, and that's sort of the nature and the involution that young people talk about. This endless competition really affects them. So it was interesting. The other question I asked them was, what quality about your children bothers you the most or worries you the most? Of course, these answers were longer, but he is kind of lazy and doesn't like any kind of sports. I think he is weak. She's not into sports in the slightest. She's overweight. He is always staying at home, never does any sports. It was funny to me that the sports thing I hadn't really thought about, but these were the Fuling students talking about their city kids. And even though the kids are now taller and bigger, there is a different physicality, right? And those Fuling kids, may have been small, but they were kind of rough and tumble. They'd grown up in the countryside, in the villages, and they did a lot of activity. And now the kids are studying so hard that they don't have time to do that. And so they were very aware of it. They also think what bothers me most is she is not interested in finding a boyfriend. You know, he is too naive and does not know how well to get along with others. He does not drink at all. He has a small circle of friends, because for that generation, the drinking was part of how you make your way in the professional world in China. So that it bothers him that the kid doesn't drink. He is likely to trust all people around him. He thinks the world is great. He is likely to be cheated. So, you know, kind of that idea of you're so focused on education that you're missing some real world contact. So when you asked about my daughters and their education, I write my students about what my daughters are doing now. And they're always really interested in that. And one of the things I told them is like that last summer, my kids are 14 in Colorado, you can get a job at 14. And they worked at the KOA. I don't know if anybody knows you know what a KOA is? Anybody who grew up in the Midwest knows what a KOA is, like a Campgrounds of America, of course, it's spelled incorrectly. But you know, these are like pretty, you know, you get a lot of very Laobaixing Americans who go to KOAs. And I just thought it was a great experience for my daughters to like deal with people and to learn how to talk to them. And my students were always really into like, I wish we could do that, but we can't because we got to study all the time. So yeah, that's something I think about a lot. Yeah. Any other questions?
How would you perceive as a foreigner living in Rivertown affect how you perceive others?
Yeah, no, that it did have a big impact on me. You know, I think it was in my mind actually when I joined the Peace Corps, was that it would be a good experience. I mean, having grown up as a white guy in middle America, it'd probably be a good experience to go somewhere where I don't look like everybody else. And that was true. You know, it makes you think, and I remember my daughter saying the same thing. They're like, you know, when we came back and there was a kid in their class who was, I think, from Mexico who didn't speak English, they were like very attentive and very trying hard to help her fit in. Because then they told me, they said, no, I know what this is like this is hard. You know, and so that's one of the reasons why you take yourself out of your comfort zone, I think, is that it does make you more sympathetic to other people. And to try to understand their perspective. That was one of the best things about the Peace Corps, is that you're forced to kind of to put yourself in other people's shoes, and well, how are they seeing you, or how are they seeing, you know, it may be totally different than your perspective, and you learn to be patient with that and to respect it.
So, was technology development, we can tell that now we have more like visual materials and also social media in our life. And there's a trend change from writing blog to recording blog. And you just said the contact way, the way you contact your previous students also changed from writing letters to using your phone. So I'm wondering, does the technology impact the way that on your own non-fictional writing? So if there's an impact, what changed and what remained?
Yeah, no, it's certainly, yeah, I mean, you know, in some ways, I miss the days when we wrote letters, because we would write these long letters. I had these amazing things that they would write, you know, describing their jobs, their first jobs, describing their courtships, their marriages. And actually, you know, now, of course, there's a lot of Weixin, right? I mean, everybody, but I kind of play dumb and act like I don't really understand Weixin. And I tell my students, well, just write me on email, because they write better on, to be honest. So like, I try to keep the conversation to something where people actually write. I'm a little bit of a Luddite. Like, I don't like all the new stuff very much. Like my daughters, they're in high school, they don't have cell phones. You know, I'm not sure when they will get them, but not soon. Like we'll wait as long as possible. And it's fine. You realize it's fine. Like, you know, they don't need them actually, and they don't complain about it. You know, they do other things. So yeah, it is a change though, you know, and of course there's some tools that are very useful. But a lot of it, I feel like I miss the kind of communication we used to have, basically.
If you have a chance to go back to China again, or will you consider to go to foreign to teach?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, first of all, we're probably not gonna go back because my kids are in high school and we want them to finish high school in the US. We certainly don't want them to do the golf club. It's like, so one of the reasons why we went there for them to be in like third grade and so on, because we thought that those are earlier ages and it's not quite as much pressure. Of course, there was still plenty of pressure. But so for now, we're gonna be in the US living because it's better for them at this stage. I think that now the political climate is such that I wouldn't want to be teaching and writing. I don't think that works. I explain all this in my book, but when I went to Chuanda, I didn't expect to be writing about the pandemic in the New Yorker. You know, once events started to happen, I felt like I should write about them, and especially because almost all the American journalists had been kicked out. And I was there, and I just didn't feel like it was right to just say nothing. This was an important event, and it was important for countries to know what other countries were doing. And the US-China relationship was important, and I felt like I should write about it. But it wasn't ideal. I think it put pressure on the university. It made them very nervous, and my job wasn't renewed. And I feel like if I'm there now at a university, if inevitably we'd probably run into the same problem because the current political climate is so tight. Maybe that will change, you know, in 10 years, 15, I don't know, you know, so maybe there's something different in the future. But I think if I were to go back, it probably would have to be as a journalist with a journalist visa, just the way things are.
So much. Two good questions. One is you know, like excellently in China doing Peace Corps work and then ended up spending many years of your life there and writing extensive about China as well. And then again, you just mentioned it's because the editing comments that you left before the student's paper and the overall worse than political environment were pushed out of your position. So my question is like, how do you reconcile, how do you navigate that unexpected circumstances that lead you here and there? Like, do you try to control, or do you just let the flow of life happen? Like, that's the first part of my question. The second part is really, I'm curious about, is writing a core drive for you to let that to drive you to, you know, China, to do it, to Cairo, and to other parts of the world, and then I use that as a main like drive for you to experience that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, there were, you know, dispiriting aspects of, and right now it is, as I said, kind of depressing, the bad relations between US and China, the difficulties in going there as a writer. And of course it was challenging there, but at the same time, I do have so many long-term, you know, friendships there. And that really helps a lot, because those, just like you go back to that museum and that same guy's there, you know, the friendships are also like that. They're stable, you know, and there was kids that I remembered, they were dating each other as 19-year-olds. And I go back now and they have a kid in college, you know, they've been together, you know, all those years. And so that gives a different sense of that relationship. I think that helps stabilize it. So I don't take the geopolitical stuff as personally, maybe, because my personal connections are at a different level and they're more stable. You know, they're not going to be changed by that. I do notice when I do these surveys that the Fuling students, when I've asked them international questions, they're much more positive about the US, I think, than the average Chinese probably is. And it must be because of the contact with me and Adam. You know, they have a different perspective on Americans as a result of that contact. And that's something that makes me happy. You know, I feel like that's part of the reason that we were there. So, you know, but yeah, you can't, as a journalist, it's just like in, you know, in Egypt, it was often very, you know, our lives were just disrupted in all kinds of ways by the revolution and by the coup and the different things that happened. And you have to deal with it, you know, be flexible. In terms of your second question was about writing. Yeah, no, I guess that's been my main focus. I mean, ever since I was 16, it's what I wanted to do. And so it is, you know, something that kind of gives me direction and in a way keeps me grounded. It also does, I think it also helps you deal with the difficult things because you're just processing them as a writer. You know, this is something I'll write about and I'll deal with it in my writing. I would tell my students, even if you're not publishing, even if you're not a professional writer, try to write about your life. Try to write about the things you're observing and perceiving, because I do think that does give you a different sense, almost of control or of agency. If you're able to record things and process them. And it's good that I did that in Fooling in the early part, because it ended up being part of my book and part of my professional life. But even if that hadn't happened, I would have been happy to have had those notes and those kind of diary journals, because that helped me process what I was going through.
I think about the writing, as particularly your development as a writer. You mentioned that you wanted to write fiction. And I was wondering what made you decide, or what made the switch, in your mind that I'm gonna do nonfiction? And do you think there's still a possibility in the future that you can come back to stories?
Yeah, thanks. The first step was actually when I was in college. I took a nonfiction writing class by John McPhee, who's one of the best nonfiction writers in America, longtime New Yorker writer. And before that class, I had not done any journalism. And I kind of thought journalism was just news. I didn't realize you could also do creative things as a journalist and write in some of the same ways you would write in terms of fiction, in terms of the way you tell a story or describe people. And so that course opened my eyes and made me realize that you could do a lot with nonfiction. And so that was the first step. And then after that course, he told me, he said, if you ever have an idea for a story, you should pitch it to a magazine. And so that summer, actually, I did my first story. That was after my junior year. I did a freelance story about somebody I knew in Iowa doing something, and I wrote this story. It was in a magazine, and they gave me, I don't know, $600 or $700, which at the time seemed like a lot of money. And I was like, wow, I can, this is good. And I was sending out fiction stories, and it's much harder to publish fiction, and so that was part of it. Some of it was pragmatic, like I was able to sell stories in nonfiction. I was able to start to support myself. And I kind of gravitated in that direction. I think it was also a better fit for me personally, because I liked the research. I liked going out and talking to people and having to figure things out and to, to sort of, and then to manage that material. So I think it was really what I was set up for. And actually, John McPhee, my teacher, he had done the same thing. He had started out writing fiction. He wrote a novel as a young guy that wasn't published. He wrote short stories, and then he ended up shifting toward nonfiction. So I think it's probably similar with him. It was just the natural fit. I have never written fiction since I started, but since I left Fooling, and I don't know, I kind of doubt that I ever will. And it's funny. British writers do this more, it seems, than Americans when they do both. There's more of a tradition of it in Britain. But for some reason in America, it seems like once you do nonfiction, you often, that's what you focus on. Yeah, so that's my feeling now, but it may change,
How do you perceive yourself as a foreigner in China, and has this self-perception evolved over time? Do you always anticipate leaving China eventually as an aspect? Because I think things are very different from the other direction. As a Chinese student in the US, everyone assumes you want to assimilate into the mainstream society and become an immigrant eventually.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. No, it is completely different, right? Even when I lived in China, and I wasn't sure when I would leave, when I was there after Fooling and I was writing, I knew at some point I would leave. Like I never thought this is going to be my country, right? So it is a different relationship. It does make you, it probably affects your behavior. I guess I always, my permanent home is in the US. But I feel like the Chinese part of my life is obviously really permanent, and especially, my wife is Chinese American. She was born in America like me, but she also spent a lot of time in China, and she grew up speaking Chinese at home. So it's a very important part of her culture. And we made the decision to make this an important part of our daughter's culture, an important part of their life. And I expect that it will be part of their lives in the future, I think. And so I expect it to always be part of my life, but it's not the same
as it might be for somebody in your position. You know, if you are thinking about staying here, like, you know, that's a very different set of decisions and it's, you know, mindset, yeah.
Okay, I have a question, which is more about US or China. So it's a more special experience in this country. I was wondering what's your opinion about the so-called the crisis of meritocracy in the US?
Of American what?
Meritocracy system.
Oh, yeah.
System in the US. I ask so because some scholars believe that the US liberal lefts are they're increasing, you know, sense of meritocracy. They because of that they're losing the support of the poor and the working classes, and I mean the Trump's election his success in this election has kind of served as an example of that. Scholars represented by Michael Sanders, the philosopher, the political philosopher from Harvard, who is such a theory for argument. So given your experience and given China's long tradition as a meritocratic society, so I wonder what's your opinion to this, like a response to this argument.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, we kind of joke about this a lot because, I mean, it's so different looking at the Chinese perspective in that the Chinese would look at this, they'd want to become the elite. You know, if you're in China and you're like, if you're a fooling student and you're in Nongmin in 1996, your goal is to get educated and become one of these city people or one of these people who sends your kid to a Jobawu University. And it's not like that in America. You know, it's sort of funny. I mean, and my daughter's experience reflects that. Like in the Chengdu school, they became popular because they're good students. They were, you know, and even though the parents would use them to criticize the other kids didn't hold that against them because they respected them because they had learned Chinese quickly. And they were good students. And then they came back to America. And of course, the worst thing, we're at a very, typical, we're at a rural public school. It's not high powered, not a private school. And if you're a good student, that's a negative, especially if you're a girl, you know? And so that social status, it frustrated them. They're like, now I've got to kind of like pretend I don't care or pretend I'm not getting good grades. And the way they got status was through athletics, like they're good runners. And so now they have better status, but it's all because of their sports stuff. You know, nobody cares about the school stuff. So I get frustrated a little bit in the US by this, you know, like I feel like we could, yeah, I know now everybody says, you know, we're too elitist, but it's like, sometimes you could use a little more elitist, you know, like, or at least like some goals, like try to, you know, people should encourage academic fulfillment, right? And it's like, and it's kind of funny, like one of those kids I talked to, like he told me about one of my students, his classmate, who was one of the worst students in his class, who was like a really poor kid. They had the worst clothes and they all dropped out like before even Chuzhong, you know, they didn't even make it to what that would be, 7th grade. And they went off and worked in the mines in Shanxi province. But then the kid he ended up striking it rich. Like he started organizing crews, and that was the wildcat mining, and he became a millionaire, and he started real estate. So he became a huge success, no education. But he still would hang out with this former classmate who he admired because my student was the best student in the class. But it was interesting because that guy's kids ended up in Jobawu universities, you know? That's like the first thing they did, right? He's entered the real world now, I'm gonna make sure my kids get a good education. And then sometimes they don't do that in America, I feel like, you know? Even the people that make money, the value doesn't necessarily go to education. So I think it's frustrating. And my perspective is a little bit informed by that. I do think it's true that we have such a gap in the US now that people have no idea what the working class thinks, right? If you're an American who's highly educated living in a city that's pretty liberal, you're not going to know what kind of conversation somebody's having in rural Missouri or whatever. And it wasn't quite as dramatic, I think, in the past. And
my Chinese students often write me and they're like, well, who did you vote for? And what do you know, and it's like, they have no idea that like you can totally predict the way somebody voted. Like all the people I went to college with and I'm friends with, like, I'm sure we all voted for the same person. Like, it's not like it's become so divided on basis of education, right? So it is troubling. But I'm not sure the solution is necessarily to become less educated. You know, like sometimes I feel like that's what people are indicating. You know, like, I'd rather see a little more in the other direction, I guess.
I'm an archaeologist, so I really enjoy that book on oral bones. I actually them for my dissertation. I was just wondering, how is that book received after this publication, and whether you still kept in touch with the people involved in that book, especially that Uyghur driver who ended up in the US.
Yeah.
Right after 9/11.
Yep.
So yeah, many of the people is very likely for me. Li Xueqin's silence in your response about the question of Chen Wenjia was very striking.
Yeah, Li Xueqin, of course, is gone now. Some of the people are gone, like David Keatley, who was up in Berkeley, who really was very helpful with helping me understand, because the Oracle Bones is an incredibly complicated, set of artifacts and the Shang period. And anyway, so I had they were very generous. I had these great archaeologists were very generous in spending time with me. It was a great project. My Uyghur friend, I saw him before I went to China in 2019, and then I was in DC a couple months ago, and his numbers changed. I couldn't find him. So, but I need to make a trip back and talk to some other people who would know him. I think he's still, he was doing great the last time I saw him. So I'm hopeful that everything's fine. But it did concern me a little bit that I wasn't able. I tried his email and his phone. But the last time I'd seen, he'd been doing well. This book was not published in China. It could not be published in China because of all the Uyghurs, and there was stuff about Liu Si, and there was stuff about, of course, Cultural Revolution. You mentioned Chen Wenjia, and so it was too sensitive. But a lot of people there read it on, kind of bootleg versions or, PDFs that are passed around, which is fine. The same thing with my new book is not published there. But I get letters from people a lot saying, I read your book. I'm sorry that I stole it, but and to me, I understand. I'd rather have them read it. I wish it could be published there, but I'd much rather have it be read.
Okay, we're running out of time. Maybe I see there's 3 questions. How about we take these 3 questions in succession, and then you give a kind of final closing remark based on those. So,
yeah, thanks for I appreciate that input by the slides, right? I was just curious, you mentioned some differences between Chinese and American classrooms. One of them being, for example, not willing to raise your hand as a student. Could you just kind of what do you think leads to that, like in terms of maybe the family or academic environment factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's all kinds of things that go in. I mean, part of the way is the way classrooms are structured, right? I mean, American classrooms are very spontaneous, relatively speaking, from the start. Like when I left schooling, I helped tutor. I was at home briefly, my parents' home in Missouri, and I was working on Rivertown, writing that book. And I would go there was an elementary school down the street, and they had 2 Chinese kids who had shown up without any English. And so they were kind of adjusting to the language and to being in an American classroom. And one of the things that really threw them was it was not orderly, right? They'd sit around tables that were circular, and they'd move every day. And it really threw these kids because they were used to a Chinese system, which was very structured. And so that has an effect, right? Because in America, it's like, yeah, I want to say something, I'll raise my hand. And some of it, I think, is probably also just individualism. This tradition in the West that you speak up and that, your opinion matters, or you need to make yourself heard. I think it's very different in China. And people are not encouraged to think of themselves as that way or to behave in that way. But yeah, some of it's also just numbers, right? American class, like my kids were in classes of 50 kids in Chengdu, even at a very good school, the class was that big. And if you don't want 50 kids all talking at once, right? So it's very structured. I mean, they would sit, you had to have both feet on the floor and one hand on top of the other like that, And then if the teacher calls on you, you stand up before you speak, When they came to the American school in Colorado, the whole first week, Ariel, my daughter, said she had to keep stopping herself from doing this. Because she still had that in her mind, from 2 years in Chengdu. So it was an adjustment for her. So, yeah, it's always interesting to think about those contrasts.
One is, since you went to China different times, and I did the same thing. I first went there in the early 70s, and then throughout the years, I keep going back. But I haven't been back lately, so I want to find out what is your observation in terms of corruption? And then the second thing is, based on what you taught, you actually teaching experience. Since there's such tight information control in China still, how are the kids being impacted? And how resolute are these kids in terms of trying to get factual information from the outside world?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. In terms of corruption, I mean, it was amazing that the 2000s was a really crazy period, right? And there's just unbelievable the things that would happen, and people would talk to you very openly about corruption, and you would participate in different ways. And it was interesting when I was doing my surveys, like initially those fooling students that I was talking to, they were very positive about Xi Jinping initially because of the anti-corruption campaigns. So there was a period when they were, I would get these surveys back and they felt like they could see an impact in their communities and the people they dealt with. And some of them said, yeah, I go to a government office now and people actually serve me because they're afraid that if people report them for not doing their jobs. So they initially saw it as something positive, but then as time has passed and as the overall climate has gotten more repressive, I hear much, much less about that. And I can tell that they've definitely cooled on the leadership and it's not something they're happy about anymore. But yeah, I mean, that was obviously such a big part of those 2000s. And then there was probably this inevitable reaction to it. And I don't know what the next stage is, to be honest. It's still, it's bound to still be there, but I think it takes different forms in this kind of environment. And your second question was about, oh yeah, for the information. Yeah, I mean, I noticed this in my classes that my freshmen, when I taught first year students, they often didn't know how to use a VPN. But then when I would teach juniors and seniors, they all knew how. So, and often my freshmen would come to me and they say, can you help me do a VPN? And I couldn't really, because I had done one with a US credit card, so I was like, go talk to a junior or a senior, and their teachers would tell them this. Well, you should Google this. And they would say, well, how do we Google? And they're like, I can't tell you about that. My department gives me support, but I can't help you with that. So it was funny, it was like this kind of game in this almost in the universities, because actually most of the departments did help the teachers arrange their VPNs and to get around the firewall, because you got to do research, and you're in certain departments. And it was an open, like kind of an open secret that the students needed to learn. As I mentioned in the book, it's all like part of the curriculum. It's part of what you learn at a Chinese university is how to get around this stuff. So I found them pretty good at getting information. I said, and that's another big difference from the 90s, of course, when people, had very hard to get anything about the outside world. The young people today are in China are much savvier and much more connected. They often disengage from politics. They see it as pointless. They don't want to deal with it, but they know what's going on. That's a big difference.
Generous with our questions. This is the final word, final question.
I started reading your work when I was in college from Vietnam, and I actually visited the underwater museum.
Oh, okay.
So I learned about it. So I'm wondering, since you're having like from China to the US, and what's going to happen next, and are you, in the future, are you going to write about China? And yes, what would be the tentative thing about it?
Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, my next project I'm pretty sure is going to be a memoir. It's something I've been planning for a long time, partly because I knew there would be this period when my daughters were in high school when we would be in the United States. And this is a project that doesn't require a lot of travel. I'd rather not be traveling as much now. And so that's the next thing I'm going to work on.
I'm not really saying more details about it, but it's just that, so I've had this in mind for a long time. I do expect that eventually I'll go back to China, I hope, to live and report there. But it will depend on, of course, how things go in terms of getting visas and American journalists being there. But I'm hopeful that eventually it will be possible. But yeah, and I'd like to thank the university very much for hosting me. Thank you, Michael, very much for the conversation. Also, I mean, it's great to see so many students from China. I hope that you are engaged by your experience here. And I, just like my experience in China helps me see the US differently, I think that your experience here will help you see China differently as well. And these in-between perspectives, I think, are so critical. Like all of us who have been back and forth, it changes you fundamentally. I think that's a good thing. It's also great to see the younger students who are here. I often tell, Americans who are studying Chinese or interested in China, like, there are so few people doing this now, I feel like, where there's been a dip in people studying Chinese and certainly a big drop in Americans going to China. I actually feel like this is a moment when there's a great opportunity because we need this new generation of experts, people who live in China, who speak Chinese, who are engaged with it. And so I think you have a lot of opportunity there. And I hope that you think about that as you make your decisions about college and about what you're going to study. But again, thanks to everybody, and yeah, have a good holiday next week.
Thank Peter again. It's such a pleasure to have him, and we appreciate you indulging us for these last 2 hours, and we learned so much. And of course, we'll continue to learn from your books. And thanks everyone for attending. Our co-sponsors, Asia Pacific Center, East Asia Library, Center for Chinese Studies. Again, join our mailing list. Our events are donor supported. So if you are in a position to support us, we also appreciate that kind of support as well. So, but biggest thanks go to Peter. This has been just tremendous. So thank you again.
Thank you.